So joining us in this examination are Dr. Fiona Kerr. She's the founder of the Neurotech Institute, where she studies the partnerships and problems that are merged between humans and artificial intelligence. Also joining us is moral philosopher and ethicist Dr. Matt Beard. Among other things, Matt is the resident philosopher for the Kids Ethics podcast, Short and Curly. Please welcome Fiona and Matt. Fiona, so we've got AI, we've got big data. When you put the two together, you get Facebook. Facebook is using AI to profile its users. It's using that to then curate, I like to say censor the news feed to make the news feed as engaging as possible. And some people say addictive rather than engaging. It sort of depends on how you want to slice that. Now, this also creates filter bubbles. It provides an environment for fake news. We already know this. But it also means that Facebook has built a tool for emotional manipulation, and we know that as well, and they've been caught using that. How do we need to start to think about how we design using such powerful tools so that we don't end up with monstrous results?
Easy question. So there's a lot of things we could talk about around the complexity of this, of aligning agreement on how you reward organizations and companies to make AI for sort of positive things, for having a look at how we measure the impact that things have on us. Some people would actually call Facebook a surveillance company rather than anything else. At discussions around the safety of information, the Orwell versus Huxley thing. So I know there's a lot of discussion around whether our information is safe. We were just talking about Fitbits backstage. But the other side of that is what's just as difficult for our society is the, what we desire controls us aspect. So the fact that we have things which are designed to addict and to keep you distracted means that we very often don't even ponder the big questions.
Because we can't get the mind share because we're just drawn in.
They look down instead of look up, and there's all sorts of neurophysiological changes that happen there. But if we go big, so one of the things I do is work with the Finnish steering committee on designing their artificial intelligence program for the country. So some of the questions are quite large, like how do we align moral, ethical values between Eastern, Western and Middle Eastern countries in order to design AI which enables rather than disables.
So opens possibility rather than shutting them down.
So I could go on all day about all of the aspects, but one of the really big things, if you take it down again to be more simple, then the question shapes the system. So very often, what I see, because I'm part of building technology, I love technology, as the engineering bit of me builds it, but the neuroscience bit of me has a look at what happens in people's brains and bodies. So I've got one project with soldiers and their robot, and another project with the neurophysiological impact of touch and eye gaze on healing. Like, they seem really opposite, but they're not. They're really informative, across each other. If you have technology that's designed for a good outcome, for a good question, so it's a human-centric question, and it's often for the common good, then the way that we utilize and the brains that go towards designing technology, we create absolutely awesome things. It's amazing. If the question is only for the benefit of one, and especially if the question is actually a negative for others, especially vulnerable groups, the lonely, the old, the young, the sick, then technology is just as strong at filling that space and it's succeeding in the outcome because it's goal-driven and it's optimizational. That's how it works. But it's the wrong question. So what we need to get a lot better at, and what things like some governments are better at. So in Finland, we have completely different discussions around how you shape policy to drive positive rewards for designing and creating and building and using technologies that positively enable human-centric outcomes. And in other countries, we don't have those discussions.
So change the questions, change the outcomes.
Yes.
Matt, we do have a big question here, but I really want to ask you first, because we've posited that big tech has a moral compass. Does it have a moral compass? And if it had one, what would it look like?
Short answer, no, but requires nuance. Big tech doesn't have a moral compass because moral compasses are things that people have.
Right.
So we say the ethics of technology as though there's this piece of technology that is independent of the people who use it and the people who build it and the people who design it. So in that sense, no. In the sense of, do the people who design these technologies have a moral compass? Yeah, they do. And I think if you actually speak to people who are involved in design, very few of them go into work hoping to build the Death Star today. What happens is that just like any compass, a moral compass is only valuable if it's well aligned. And in order to be well aligned, it has to know where north is, it has to be oriented in the correct direction. And the challenge that we're having is that we don't quite know how to orient that compass at the moment. And the challenge is not unique to technology in a lot of respects, but what is unique to technology and what becomes a real ethical challenge is that although technology doesn't have an inherent moral compass, it has an inherent logic. So there is a kind of operating logic that all technology has. Because technology isn't just stuff, it's a way in which we look at the world. And when we look at the world with a kind of technological gaze, we don't look at it as a mystery to be experienced, we look at it as a problem to be solved. And when you look at the world as a problem to be solved, and there are lots of problems we need to solve, but when you do that, suddenly everything becomes something that is within your control, and your goal is to control it and to make it bend to your will.
So rather than having a conversation or a negotiation, it's more about an attitude of almost enslavement.
Well, enslavement becomes the extreme end of that and doesn't necessarily need to go to that extreme. But when you apply that kind of a logic where everything can be reduced so that we can measure it, so that we can store it, so that we can control it, so that we can understand it. Some of the things that happen become that I am no longer a person who uses Facebook. I am a series of data points that can be sold and collected and utilized to achieve a particular goal. Now, that's not benefiting me. It's not even recognizing me as a person at that stage. It's doing something quite different. And it's doing something that in some ways the entire conversation about morality is kind of allergic to. And that's where our challenges arise, I think.
All right, Seth, one of the big things that's in your book, and your book is wonderful, is about the confessional nature of people typing things into Google searches, and also, and you didn't mention this on stage, but Pornhub. And it relies on the fact that it's open, anyone can type anything into it, anyone can use it, and you then get this volume of data from people about what they're actually feeling, who they're actually attracted to, all of these different things. One of the questions, now you're using this data because this data is anonymized and open, but what happens when this data is used asymmetrically? In other words, when an organization is gathering this data and through that they know a lot about the people who are using it, but then rather than revealing it, simply use that then to either undermine or to shape or direct the people that they've learned so much about?
It's a concern. It's definitely an issue. The ethical issues of big data are really, really big. I'm kind of the type, I just like find people so interesting, so I just get really excited. But I'm not blind to the fact that there are issues that companies have these powerful tools and know so much about people. And there are one example, they've found you can predict someone's intelligence or someone's performance on an IQ test based on what they like on Facebook. And some of them aren't so surprising. If you like Mozart, you're more likely to have a high IQ. Like, okay, probably pretty obvious. But some of them are really surprising. If you like curly fries, you're more likely to have a high IQ. So who here likes curly fries? We're the genius. Oh, yeah. Everybody lies, right? I doubt you. But that's weird. So data's weird, right? So if you think about it, curly fries, the population that likes curly fries isn't identical as the population that doesn't like curly fries. They're different on many dimensions. And for whatever reason, it turns out the curly fries population is a higher IQ population.
That, for whatever
correlated, though.
reason, though, that's the crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Because, is it because we're liking curly fries? I say we because, of course, I'm part of this intelligent population. But is it that they have a shared sense of irony, and that's why they kind of do these things? And the danger in that is not to say, well, this is a terrible data model and you shouldn't use this to gain some information. The danger is when HR companies use those kind of correlations and they assume that they are actually genuine correlations.
They're causative.
Yeah,
and
that
they're
there's
not.
a causation involved there. And that's where some of this stuff...
But I can see an entrance review at Google, right, where you're being reviewed for a job, and they just put a set of French fries out for you. And if you gravitate to the curly fries, you get the job, right?
Well, you probably don't even get in the room, right? If you are going to take this model to its extreme, they would have already scraped your publicly accessible Facebook data and screened you before they even put you in the room.
I think it's not even as simple. It's not even that a HR department's going to know this and try to play these games with people. It's that the world's moving towards machine learning and artificial intelligence, and computer scientists don't even understand how machine learning works. So they may just scrape everybody's data set and just say, find us people who are smart, and it's going to use in its model curly fries liking as a factor, and someone who doesn't like curly fries is going to be punished, and nobody even realizes what's going on, but it's all kind of this black box of artificial intelligence and machine learning.
So there's a couple of things there around how you write the right algorithm and how you bound the right information, and again, how you ask the right questions. So even there, excuse me, we've got a whole set of people that don't use Facebook at all. Is it because they're actually too intelligent to eat curly fries and use Facebook? Or so we've got all of these data sets that we don't look at. So partly the machine learning is an issue. And so again, it gets back to how do you utilize the data and how do you cut off the outliers of any form of data that you use. So one of the problems, we've got really good data builders. So, Gapminder, Hans Rosling, those sort of people. Again, it was a positive question. They were trying to make the world a better place. The way that they gathered data was really amazing. The way that they used data was really good. He understood how you map it and that you captured outliers to know where things are going. But most of the time, as you've said, what we do is we have algorithms that trim, codify, simplify, and you end up with a really small, very oversimplistic, indicator of something which is not necessarily the indicator at all.
So, Matt, I want to tie this into something we were talking about backstage around this complaint system. Because, again, here, Fiona, here's something where you're actually trying to do the right thing and trying to answer the right question is how do you deal with complaints that are coming in and manage them? Talk to us about that design and how it produced an unintended outcome.
So one of the interesting things in complaints handling is that a lot of it is becoming automated because the scale of services we're administering mean it's really hard. People want efficient responses. When they have a complaint to an organisation, they want to hear back fairly quickly that their complaint has been acknowledged, has been heard, and a lot of that can be now automated through chatbots and things like that. And what the chatbot has learnt is through kind of machine learning and natural language processing, it's watched a whole heap of conversations transpire, and those have been coded in certain ways, and it's learnt to code them to understand. So it can tell whether you are what they might code as a compliant complaint, whether you are an aggressive or a hostile complaint, whether you are a high influence complaint, if they can correlate you with a kind of social media profile or something like that. And the thing is that what they've been told is a positive outcome is we want as little negative feedback, we want as many happy customers as possible, right?
And that seems, on the face of it, it seems very reasonable.
And it is reasonable. The challenge that arises, and as a moral philosopher, one of the things I'm interested in is how the way we arrange our societies and our practices shapes our character and the kinds of people we are. What this system can do, and what some of them have done, is if you are flagged as a hostile complaint, you'll get bumped forward in the line. So they'll want to deal with you more quickly because then you're less likely to leave the organisation, you're less likely to take your business elsewhere or file a kind of public complaint. What that's doing is rewarding antisocial behaviour. It's encouraging precisely the kind of behaviour we don't want, and it's punishing the person who chooses to be patient, who takes their time. But arguably more significant to me, it's also punishing cohorts of the population who, for cultural reasons or for reasons of their age, and there might be a kind of a generation where it was just part of how we did things, that we weren't aggressive, we didn't treat people in particular ways. And so norms of politeness, which are correlated with particular communities, suddenly entire communities are receiving less efficient treatment because of the way that this is carved out. And these are what I call kind of crystal ball problems, because they're the things that are really hard to foresee when we work at these things at scale. It is possible, but it takes a lot more robust kind of user testing and beta testing before these things get put to market. And it challenges the kind of Silicon Valley culture of move fast, break things, fail fast.
Well, you now have the idea of move fast and break people. Right, that's the thing. It's not just breaking things, but you're now, because these systems are so intimately connected to us.
Well, if you buy what I said before about technologic and stuff, people are just things when you take this kind of gaze. And that's, that's a scary thing.
It also shows the difference again in the question, or in the what we're measuring. So if the motivator is, we don't want fuss, then that's what you'll get. What's interesting is those companies that flip that and say, okay, so what is it that we really should be, what are we here to do? And so the outcome driver then is to maximize the fixing of the problem. And the second thing is to take into consideration that if people are actually stressed, there is a level of stress with humans when they need to flip straight to a human being. Then if you put those two in as the drivers of the algorithm, then you get a very different pattern as well, because you're not just ignoring the people who will be ignored. It's the actual fixing of the problem in a logical, efficient way that becomes the driver. And they're also reading for when do we actually have to flip them out? When's the human better? When do we have to flip them into the human?
All right, so Fiona, what you're doing is you're pointing up the fact that we've identified these problems and we can now see some ways to remediate these problems. But the remediations are coming because we've only discovered the problem. So are we, and big tech more generally, in a larger learning cycle that's helping us grow a moral compass because we've made some horrible mistakes?
I think that's humans in general with technology. The pattern right from the steam engine has been that. You go ahead, you get it wrong, and you patch them up.
Yeah.
This is just far-reaching and fast. But one of the things that, I guess, again, I notice, it depends on the country. Some countries are better at understanding that whenever you put technology and humans together, you will get emergent behaviour with unintended consequences. And if you say, okay, so how do we make a profit out of that? You're going to have a completely different system and set of laws, policies, sort of stopgap measures, than if you say, so how do we make sure that any of those emergent behaviours end up with a human-centric positive outcome?
So Seth, one of the big things I was taking away from reading the book is, and in the context of this conference where we're talking about the world divided, is that there's a suspicion. We feel that social media has fed into this idea of a divided world. Part of your data shows that, in fact, the people who we think are the most divided are also the people who are most actively reading what the other side is thinking. And so there's this interesting paradox here. Do we have any sense of how we might be changing settings or influencing this situation to help close the divide, or is the divide completely separate from what we think it is?
Yeah, so there's this idea, I'm sure everyone's heard of it, the filter bubble, that basically on the internet, you just read what you want to read, right? So you just associate with people who are like you, so you're constantly getting news that agrees with your point of view. So if you're a liberal on Facebook and Twitter and all these other sites, you're going to be kind of just getting people saying what you already agree with. And if you're conservative, you're going to be getting conservative news. It turns out that's not really true. So it is true on the internet that we associate more with people who share our political views. So your friends on Facebook are much more likely to agree with your political views than to not agree with your political views. And when they post, they're probably going to be posting things you already agreed with. But what we fail to understand is that's also true in the offline world. So your colleagues, the people you work with, much more likely to share your political views than not share your political views. The people you live near, your neighbors, much more likely to share your political views than not share your political views. Your family members, your friends, the club, people that are in the clubs you're in, all much more likely to share your political views than not share your political views. It turns out you're actually more likely to come across people with opposing political views online than offline. And one of the reasons for this is because on Facebook, you tend to be friends with so many people, including your weak ties. So not just your 10 closest friends or the people who you might join a dinner party with, you're also friends with people you haven't seen since high school, or that crazy uncle you can't stand and don't invite to your holidays. And these people are much more likely to have opposing views. Mm-hmm. So we're actually more likely to be exposed to opposing views online than offline. So I think, kind of going back to your question, I'm not even sure that we need to do that much to intervene because the problem probably isn't as severe as we think it is.
But there's a perception. So is the technology amplifying our perception, or is it amplifying the problem, or can we even ask that question?
So there's another issue that people seem to be really mean online. Right. And that I haven't seen studies of, but...
So Fiona, we have data on that, though, right?
Yeah, we do. And even what you're talking about, what's really interesting, that's where the neuroscience part of it's really interesting. So one of the things that is really different is the level of active empathic engagement that occurs over technology. And because of the way our brains work, when we need to make a decision, especially a complex decision or especially a morally based, values-based decision, we make quite a different one if we are directly interacting with other human beings because of the chemicals, the resonance, the synchronization of interpersonal neural synchronization.
Because it's the way we've evolved.
We've evolved to do all sorts of things. So we've got, more than 100 chemicals going between us now. And that's why you equilibrate, all sorts of hormonal things. And so when you work in the same space, it's called dynamic resonance. Eye gaze does a number of things with different parts of our brain that start us to connect and have different sorts of chemicals. So what you get is you get a different pathway in the brain that lights up and makes decisions in a different way. So one of my projects
Which is not happening if you're online because you're not getting eye gaze or any of those other cues.
So it gets beautifully complex. So if I've never seen you before, and I only see you or hear you for the first time over technology, there's a part of my brain that will not stand up when I see you over a screen, that will only stand up when I see you face to face. Once we have met each other and we actually create a neural connection, and we actually create a physical change in our brains. So that's why the cold call is awful, but once you've met people, then there's a different connection, because actually when you then use technology, there's a bit of your brain that physically can connect down to engagement. So it becomes really important when you're trying to solve complex problems. Mm-hmm. So I'm studying the rise of short-termism, right from prime ministers down around the world, with the rise of using technology to try and fix complex problems. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing looking at that. But another thing is, yes, you can actually get some empathic engagement over technology. One of the interesting things is this difference in study between just people surfing and trying to get information, and then people working together, again, on an ethical problem. Right. They search differently. The amount of time they take to look is different. The stickability of the behavior in trying to change something is different, because it's one thing to sit in a living room with a few people that are passionate about changing something. When you're online and you get these posts of, oh, isn't that terrible what's just happened in Sudan, everybody should do something, and everyone does something for 5 minutes and then thinks, tick, I'm now a moral person, I've done something, I don't have to do anything else. There's no emotive, no empathic movement there, but there is movement if you group together and use online facilities to get information really, really well, you're a lot deeper, you're a lot wider, and the information is used differently.
So the value is in the mix.
Yes.
Right, it's about not being exclusively online. And there's value in being completely embodied, but there's an enormous value in the mix if we get the mix right. Now, tell us the story about the Honeybot, because this is a case where we got the mix wrong.
Yeah, and yes. So, excuse me. So one of the things I do is work advising robotics companies on how to design the robots for, aged care children. So a couple of years ago, I was looking at a video on a family bot, which we're going to have a lot of family bots and care bots and all those sorts of things. And in came this little honey bot. You saw people on the floor, the father, the son, and the son was acting up. And the voiceover said, "Aren't you annoyed if whenever you try and play with your child, they ignore you and they're naughty, and they don't know what they're doing, bad behaviour? Enter a Honeybot," and this little thing comes in on wheels, little screen and a kind of drip body, and the child hugs it and they say, "This will help you to learn to communicate with your child, and it will help you to teach the child moral behaviour." And so I watched for the couple of minutes in increasing dismay as everyone was looking at the screen, and they threw in a little educated thing as well so that you were a good parent. And then the mum disappeared. The dad was sitting in the kitchen while the child was in bed with Honeybot reading the story. And then the dad could, it says you can even send voices, funny voices, when it's time for Johnny to go to sleep. So that gets sent to Honeybot, and Honeybot goes, "Going to sleep, Johnny?" And he says, so no parent's gone near them. So I'm thinking, great, because if you then switch over into how you instill moral and behavioural, boundaries in children, it's actually the hippocampal and amygdala areas are really important. You need a lot of direct eye gaze. You can go into the study of psychopathy. There's all sorts of fascinating things. So what we end up with is the family bot, which actually drops the capacity for the child's brain to grow all of that rich neural sort of framework around communication, compassion, connection, what's right and wrong in behaving.
And so unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences.
Trying to answer a question, but it ending up producing a much bigger side effect.
Yes, and part of that is because they don't actually, it goes back to you. They didn't want to build, if I'd gone to Silicon Valley and said to these guys, "You're just building psychopaths," then they would just say to me, "Go away, Luddite, that's the door." So they don't want to build the Death Star. They just didn't know about how our brains have to be stimulated to grow those aspects.
So to tie this in, then what you did is you piqued their curiosity around this, which is exactly what Seth says is the way forward when we get to these loggerheads.
Yes. So what I do is go and say, "Yeah, isn't this great? Show me what the robot does." And then I say, "Let's have a look at the neurophysiology of humans around what has to be stimulated in order to do what you're trying to do. Oh, isn't that interesting? Yours actually drops it. And we need to raise it. So how would you design this to raise it?" And then they've got a way forward. They've got something to do.
What you do is you change the metrics. So how do you measure success? How do you measure kind of happiness? Well, okay, if the problem is frustration between parent and child, then you minimize frustrating interactions. But if the byproduct of that is minimizing interactions generally, you might measure, okay, there are lots of positive interactions, we can code those, we can observe those, but unless you actually know what you ought to be designing for. Another example of that I find really interesting is a device called the Snoo baby crib. And the Snoo baby crib is an automated crib that detects when your newborn child is starting to wake up, starts to play white noise, starts to rock in a particular way to kind of bring them back to sleep.
So they don't wake you up in the middle of the night.
Correct, yeah, and gradually learns which strategies are most effective to prolong sleep and all those kinds of things. Now, I first read this when my son was about 8 weeks old and was very bad at sleeping. But at a time when I was working quite long hours, and because a newborn child would go down to sleep at around 6 before I was home, so my hours between about 11:30 and 5:30 a.m., that was my time to be dad. And So if the measurement is we want to maximize sleep, great, the baby crib's going to do that. And it's got really valuable roles. If you are a single parent working 2 jobs who desperately needs sleep, there's a place for that. But when it's marketed as the magic sleep solution and it's sold to fix a problem that isn't actually there, because it's not a problem when a child wakes during the night. The child is hungry. The child needs skin-to-skin contact.
Exactly.
But it also builds an attachment between me and my son that's not going to build if that process is automated. So this is the difference between replacing humanity and enhancing humanity. And when you talk about a human-centric design question, it's about enhancing the things that make us us rather than replacing them. And when you ask that question, unfortunately, the elephant in the room here is capitalism. If your goal is not to enhance humanity, but to maximize or enhance your kind of return on investment, you ask very different questions. You design very different technology. You design technology that makes you want to spend as much time as possible on that phone instead of put that phone away as soon as you've had the interaction you needed to have.
So there's 2 things that are going on here. One is that you can ask big tech, which you're prioritizing. You're prioritizing the human qualities, or you're prioritizing your bottom line, right? But then you also have to, in terms of everyone in this room, and thank you for not checking your devices because I have been watching, but you have to go to a consumer. How does a consumer, and we're all consumers in that sense, how do we interrogate? How do we ask a question about what is the quality? Is this going to make me more part of the machine, or is this going to help me to be more myself, or more connected as a parent or a partner? Or
Yes. One of the things that can actually make it quite simple, because I often get people saying, I really want to step into the conversation about how should we shape technology for a human-centric future, but I don't understand the technology. You don't have to. What you have to be good at is saying, what does good look like here? So that's even something like a dinner, At dinner, what do you want the ideal dinner to look like? What do you want a family dinner to look like? If it is that you don't read the paper, because it used to be that you read books or the paper, no, that's not allowed. If you want conversation around the table, that's it. That's what you do. There are no phones. And that's for the adults, the children, everyone. So what you do is you say, what do I want this to actually look like? And in this case, can technology enable that? If it can, you use technology, and it's wonderful. But there are times when a human is actually more efficient, more effective, even at work, because of the way our brains work and because of the way that whole empathic connection works. We can be an awful lot more efficient than any technology ever can be. And we just need to be clever about what does each of those things bring to any situation, and what do they bring uniquely, and what do they bring? Is it a quality partnership that we're building? Or is it just a quantity partnership where it's all about money?
But I don't think we want to. I'm against the pro tech guy here.
I think everyone is pro tech, but we're sort of
absolutely.
negotiating that.
I think we don't want to be Luddites, obviously. So I take Matt's point. We don't really know the effects of a parent not being involved in the sleep process. But there could be unintended consequences, but there may not be, in which case this would be a massive gain for society, right? That if we can.
True, but we should know
better.
that before the product goes to market.
Yeah.
But I don't know, can we? Like it would take.
Well, do you want a beta test on babies? I mean, because that's essentially the question you're asking at that point.
Yeah, but I think. Yeah.
But that becomes
do we really think there are going to be these horrible long-term consequences?
Oh, there are quite often, but we don't monitor well. But again,
I feel like I'm the only one on my side.
No, it's not a side. It's how you. So again, if I go back to the Finnish example, it's how do we actually monitor? Because we don't know. Well, we do know that every medium changes us, and we're an electrochemical bag. That's what we are, and we've got an electrical system that we now carry a lot. And so yes, it's very easy to make us addicted, and we know all that stuff. But there are other things that it does for us really well. So again, it's a case of measuring a lot wider to have a look at those trends.
Well, but this is exactly what you do, is you measure wide, and you measure wide in real time. So can you envisage a kind of compass being built out of the kinds of tools that you're building that help us check in real time, that is not a good innovation, we need to back off of it, or that's having this really weird side effect?
Yeah, I think just the issue with these with like a new crib for babies is it would take 20 years to study the effects of them. And I guess I have a bias in the direction of, I am kind of pro-technology, and I think the world's getting better and better. And every time a new technology comes out, we freak out, but things aren't the same. Television, people were like, this is ruining society. What's it like? Kids, comic books. What's it, kids used to do this, now they don't do it. And I think generally people turn out okay, and the problems we have, we learn new solutions for them. So I'm a little skeptical of, like, let's really wait on some of these interventions that probably won't have hugely negative side effects, and obviously are fixing a pretty major problem in society.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is maybe part of building that moral compass is that we're now starting to think more comprehensively, that when we introduce something that we know is going to interplay with behavior, that we then take a look and we build in checks, balances, ways to be able to monitor what's happening as it's unfolding.
Well, we monitor what's happening, but we also start to think, so, okay, let's say we put the crib to market. If you want to do that because you think the cost-benefit analysis for the user is that, well, if we can help people who need to sleep, but at the very least, what you would want to do is go, how would we know if stuff was starting to go wrong here? Like, what are some of our harm metrics? Because we're great at measuring success because we can state it in kind of board reports, and we can stand up at a meeting with shareholders and we can say, look at all the things that we did. And that's great, but unless we're also saying, now's the point where we know that we need the big red button, and we need to say, okay, now's where we need an update. Now's where we need to actually recall this because it's not doing what we thought it was going to do.
Or it might do something that we don't. So, and that partly of that is the beauty of, say, independent research. So a couple of examples for me are an observation that some children now can't build blocks at school. And when you go into it, there's the way that your brain builds a physics engine, really, is
Constructivism, right.
Well, and it's, so,
by play.
If you knock something off the table, you can catch it. AI can't catch it, because that's a very difficult mathematical dynamic kind of, and it turns out that if you do nothing but scroll, whereas if you manipulate 3D, so it doesn't mean you don't have the technology, but it also means that you have the physical play. And once you know that, then what you can do is maximize how the positives of the technology can help that education. And then there's just the other quick example is just the straight, how does our brain work? So one of the things I do despair about a little bit is one of the beautiful points about the focal length of a baby is it's actually a feeding length. So, when you feed a child and they gaze into your eyes, there's a massive amount going on in their brain. And it's not just about connection and skin, it's also around the pleasure centers. It's really, really busy when it's doing that. When you see someone feeding a child and looking at their phone, that's not happening. Right. And so, and it's not that they don't want to do that, it's just that they don't know. Right. And if I ever say to a mum, or breastfeeding is a mum, but a parent, do you know what is fascinating about this? They go, and they put the phone down.
Pique their curiosity.
So that's that stuff about knowledge, if you've got knowledge, you can make really good decisions. It doesn't mean you don't use the technology. I build technology.
Right. I have one question. We're going to go to your questions, but I have the big, hairy question for you guys now. We've sort of identified that sometimes the bad decisions can get made when capital interests overrule human interests. This is one reason why we have laws and regulations. Is there a way of being able to frame, because you always have regulations when basically everything else fails, to basically prevent people from being bad actors because they just want to be bad actors. And so we say, okay, if you do this, we'll fine you or we'll put you in jail. Can we see some sort of minimum standard or minimum threshold that we can frame morally, ethically, and probably then also legally around this? What does this look like?
Okay. So yes, there is, and I think it's essential. So there's a wonderful book that's just come out by a woman named Ellen Broad, who works a lot in AI, and toward the end she talks about regulation. She talks about a conversation she had with a business ethics scholar. And in the tech community, they're very anti-regulation, and that conversation is shifting slightly, but it's always been quite averse to regulation. They say, well, what we need is ethics. We need kind of people who make good decisions within our organizations. And the response by this business professor was to say, well, there can't be ethics without justice. Unless people are going to be brought to account, unless there is something that says, this is why we take these things seriously, all this ethics stuff is really nice and it's a nice value add and it makes people feel good, but it might not have the teeth that it needs when the rubber hits the road. So yes, I think it's possible. I think things like the GDPR are starting to test that kind of environment. We're seeing
GDPR is a system in Europe now that requires data collection to be transparent and open and all of this. And it's causing a lot of trouble because companies have had to adapt to it, but it's going to be producing some new transparency around this.
That's right. And these things are happening. The last budget papers put in funding for a national AI framework within Australia that people are working on. The Human Rights Commission are looking at human rights and technology. Autonomous vehicle legislation, the German government's documents on autonomous vehicles and the way that they should conduct themselves are fascinating to look at. And they're strong regulatory regimes. So I think these things are possible. The questions are exactly what does it look like? Are these kind of like fair trade systems so that you can actually say, okay, that Alan Finkel, the chief scientist, is talking about a Turing stamp for AI, so you can know when you've got trustworthy AI. Is it something like that looks like the way that we work with pharmaceuticals? So there's a certain standard that they need to meet.
And a huge amount of testing that happens as well.
So how do we do with that? And how do we do that without stifling innovation, to Seth's point? Because there's a trade-off. You innovate slowly. There are people who aren't getting the solutions they could get as quickly as they could get them. So we need to pay attention to both sides of this story.
Okay, so this is, and this is probably going to be our closing question, which is the problem of Facebook in a lot of ways. Cambridge Analytica this year opened us up to this relationship between data, analysis, behavioral manipulation. It's the whole enchilada. What do we as users and as people who are now connected in important neurophysical ways with communities of interest and kind of don't want to quit Facebook for that reason, what do we do? Anyone?
The short but perhaps unconstructive answer is that it should not be your job, your family's job, or a vulnerable community's job to protect themselves. We have problems in our community much more broadly than technology, wherein we are not alive to the effects of things that are transpiring until they affect us. And so we don't know, and we often benefit from technology that does disproportionately affect certain groups within the population. That's why regulation and things like that become important, because you can't protect yourself from some of this stuff. It's really difficult, especially as the internet and the online space becomes a common space that we all need to share and engage in together. I think the Cambridge Analytica stuff, very briefly, my big concern, because we're talking about technology and a moral compass. What Cambridge Analytica feared, what emotional manipulation studies on Facebook revealed, is that the extent to which you freely engage in behavior online when it's mediated through these technologies is not what we thought. That our behaviors, our feelings and emotions can be manipulated and primed and constructed in certain ways. Given that power, my big fear is that whatever moral compass tech comes up with will be the last moral compass we ever have. Because the power will be
because it will set the tone.
Our attitudes in a way that continues to reward them and leaves them set. So the challenge then becomes, how do we create that space for wisdom and discernment so we can know when to change things, when to switch them off, when to challenge them?
I think the Cambridge Analytica story definitely opened important questions, and it basically started the GDPR policy, which I think is good policy. I strongly support that, and there are huge dangers of some of this data. I think the actual Cambridge Analytica issue is a little overblown. I'm not totally sure they were capable of doing what they claimed they were capable of doing. I also do point out that the big fear around Cambridge Analytica is that political parties would try to emotionally manipulate us. I mean,
every television ad ever, right?
What do political parties do all the time in all of human history? What is a speech? What is a television ad? What is a focus group? What is a survey? It's all attempts to manipulate people. So I'm hugely concerned that big data does make some of these tools more powerful, but these aren't necessarily new problems as a society, and they're always we've always been struggling with the power of leaders and politicians to get us to be scared or to be manipulated in various ways, pull our emotional tugs in ways that aren't good
And to keep us
for
perhaps
society.
narrowing down rather than opening up.
Yeah.
So personally, I think there are still things you can do yourself. I'm one of those weird people that builds technology, but yet I'm not on Facebook. I wouldn't have Alexa. I don't wear Fitbits, and there's reasons for all of that I won't go into now. But I just because I know where the data goes and what happens with it, and those sorts of things. So you can actually make choices still. One of the things you need to think about is, am I trading off my security for convenience? Because that's a really big thing that we are doing. But the other bit of that about building where we're going to go, it's a very relevant point, because when we get to artificial general intelligence or superintelligence, which is people like Nick Bostrom say, once you get there, it's the last decision you make. There's a group now creating the algorithm for being able to codify the moral basis of what human behavior will be for general artificial intelligence. And one of the problems is, if you decide that humans are, what drives human behavior, so we're having arguments about whether it's around people being inconsistent or people being unpredictable, the algorithms are really different. So it's a really technical area, it's fascinating, but once they're set, humans will actually have to obey the outcome.
First, we shape the tools.
Yes.
And then the tools shape us.
So
Ladies and
we gotta
gentlemen,
get it right.
huge thanks to the panel. Matt Baird, Fiona Kerr, and Seth Stephens-Davidowitz.